All right, everybody, welcome to the next round of NAATP talks. This is our new thing we're doing this year. The first session was earlier this morning, and it went beautifully, so we're going to do it again. And we have a wonderful lineup. So the idea here is that we have 3 consecutive 20-minute talks that are different, but related by a unifying theme. And this session's unifying theme is workforce transformation, which everybody agrees is a thing. So we're going to get these guys started. They're wonderful experts. They're wonderful speakers. They're wonderful people. I know them all. Denny Morrison is going to go first with applying augmented intelligence to workforce challenges and care delivery. Then Devin Wade is going to do highly reliable organizations, essential elements to prevent burnout and detect turnover. And then none other than Mr. Gary Fisher is going to talk about the business of leaving the profession. Maybe going on a second act, and we call it It's Hard to Say Goodbye, Just Say Farewell. So with that, please welcome Denny Morrison.
Thank you. It's always good to get the applause and the check up front. I'm Denny Morrison. I'm a psychologist by training, but I'm getting over it. And I did clinical work for a long time. Started out in substance use treatment, my first job. Moved into management, ran a mental health center for 13 years, ran a research institute for 4 years, and then joined NetSmart, the EHR company, as their first chief clinical officer. About 7 years ago, resurrected my consulting practice, and I now do consulting kind of at the intersection of clinical and technology. I've been with Elios now for about 6 years, helping them come into the market. So today we want to talk about the relationship between augmented intelligence and workforce challenges. So first, let's set the stage about what the workforce challenge looks like. The turnover rates in our industry run pretty high. It seems odd that the higher you go up in the organization, the lower the turnover rate for some reason. So we know that, but on average, it runs about 31% for the behavioral health industry generally, but and there's some differentiation among behavioral health professionals, both in mental health and substance use, but generally about a 31% turnover rate, which is hard to sustain. The projected shortages by HRSA, we're looking at a deficit of about 87,000 addiction professionals, 70,000 mental health professionals, and so on. So you can see here, and those numbers are projections, are not projections, they are estimates of current state. So if we project out what the actual need is going to be, we're looking at about a 500,000 clinician deficit going forward into the future. So when we look at the challenges of that and what contributes to that, one of the things that we find is some of the stuff that you're already familiar with, and that is the documentation burden that our industry imposes on it. And so we'll talk about that for just a second. The National Council for Mental Well-Being, when they lobby Congress, this is a position statement that the paperwork that we have to do in our industry is far more expansive than just about any other sector of healthcare, which makes in some ways not a lot of sense because we constitute about 10 to 12% of the total healthcare spending in the United States, but we have an inordinate burden to demonstrate that what we are doing is going to be acceptable, and not in a clinical sense, but more in an administrative sense. They did a survey at National Council. More than 2/3 of clinicians say that they spend more time on administrative tasks than they do on clinical tasks. We're seeing that 43% of them say they cannot get their jobs done during work hours, so they have to take their work home. That's one of the downsides of having a SaaS-based or cloud-based EHR, that you can go home and still log in and work, where in the past you would have had to have stayed at the office. We call that pajama time. About 47% say that the administrative tasks they do have no value, particularly in terms of clinical care delivery. So can technology help this solution? I don't know about you. So how many of you will, when your IT folks say it's time to get a new password, ask yourself, how many more exclamation points can I put on my password to get, see? When we think about this, as you know, I'm from Indiana. I'm from Bloomington, Indiana. Had a pretty good football year this year, by the way. When we talk about AI, in Indiana, there's a thing that's been getting popular. It's called artificial intelligence. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it has kind of taken the world by storm. And the turning point was when ChatGPT came on the site about 4.5 years ago. Elios, the company I consult to and serve as their chief clinical officer for, came on the scene 2 years before that. But when ChatGPT came on board, we've been using AI for a long time in all aspects of healthcare, but it really just caught fire when ChatGPT launched, and that's when we all started using it and getting access to it. And the core of these things, these artificial intelligence models like the ones we use, is a thing called a large language model. And it is the infrastructure, it's the engine that runs this. And you have to give it data. You have to train it on a kind of a universe of information so that it'll work. So when you log in to use, say, Claude or Copilot or ChatGPT or Gemini, any of these, the training that these things received, in this case, we'll look at ChatGPT. In the case of ChatGPT, about 16 to 30% of that content that trained that model was based on vetted content like books, magazines, things that had an editor look at to make sure they were appropriate and accurate. The other 70 to 84% was scraped from the internet. So think about everything that's on the internet and just imagine hoovering up all that data and using that to train your model. And that's why we can ask kind of almost any question of our kind of over-the-counter AIs, and they'll have some pretty good answers for that because it's kind of a general purpose knowledge base. Hopefully it's screened out some of the junk, but not always. If you followed anything that the AI Grok tool that Meta has released, there's been horrendous examples of it giving erroneous information, biased information, and racist information. And so, that's one of the problems with this. But when you look at these things, these are really, I use these all the time. These are great for general purpose information and knowledge. They are not meant for clinical purposes. But I can tell you, even if you don't have an AI kind of linking to your documentation system or your EHR, I can tell you your clinicians are using it to write progress notes. Every organization I've been to, that's been the case, and that's not a good idea for the reasons that you're seeing right now. There are really 3 levels because you have to train these things. So like, for example, if the biggest use case in healthcare for artificial intelligence in general healthcare is radiology. It's been around longer in radiology because it's easier to train an AI on images. So I can say, here's an image of a cancer cell in the lungs on an x-ray, and this is an image of a healthy lung x-ray. And you do that 1,000,000 times from different points of view, you can train the AI on that model. So a radiology artificial intelligence is trained on only those data. That's the only thing that's in there. So if you were to log into a radiology AI and say, how do I differentiate alcohol misuse from alcohol addiction or something like that, it should say, I have no idea, because it's not in the sphere of knowledge of what it has learned. And so these things run on the kind of commercial databases that we're all familiar with, ChatGPT, Amazon Web Services, et cetera. But the training data is what restricts their kind of focus of knowledge to just what they're supposed to be doing. So radiology might be running on Amazon or it might be running on ChatGPT even, but the training data has said, this is what I want you to know, and that's it. And you don't go outside of that. So there's really 3 levels of training data that you can use. The kind of off-the-shelf tools that we all use every day, and I'm a big proponent of Claude. I've been using Claude for a long time. By the way, it's the only general-purpose AI that has a philosopher on staff whose job it is to make sure that Claude behaves in a moral fashion. That's what made me pick them. This is long before the DoD kicked them out, and they just made a moral stand and said, we're not going to allow you to use our AI to target innocent civilians. We're sorry, we're not going to do that. That was way before that. That's why they did that. Their whole philosophy seems to be more based in a moral framework than other tools. But these are the tools that we all use, we all have access to. Not a lot of vetted content in there, as you saw previously, but they're good for what they do. And with your prompts, you can start restricting for what you want to use. The secret sauce in these things is how to write prompts to get them to work for you. The second level up, and this is really a response, a lot of the EHR companies are doing this now, where they don't have time to build a behavioral health specific training data set because you need huge amounts of data. That's why the original ones just hoovered up that information from the internet, because it was a bunch of information, a bunch of data, but you can't, the time it takes to build an AI specific, a behavioral health specific training data set is huge. So what's happened now is a lot of the AI products that are linked to EHRs are renting like Amazon Medical Services database for their training data set, and it's normed on primary care and orthopedics. Now, that is quantitatively better than the general purpose AIs, but it's not as good as a behavioral health specific data set. Elios's data set, for example, has 15 million minutes of nothing but psychotherapy transactions. So if you say to that database, what does this x-ray look like, it's not going to have any idea what you're talking about because it's not in its fund of knowledge. And there's only really 3 companies that I know of that are doing that. So when we think about implementing these things, I'm not going to go into a lot of details about this. There are like multiple ways of measuring implementation, and the implementation science research really summarizes here, like these are the things that you have to take into consideration. But from a practical perspective, when you look at implementing something like an artificial intelligence tool, the way that organization does its training and how it onboards your providers on how to use AI, and more specifically, how to talk about AI in the clinical context with their clients, that's one of the things that your provider should be able to help you with in detail. So how does this work? Well, the key to what most of us are talking about is what's called ambient listening. And so you have a computer sitting there listening to a psychotherapy transaction, and at the end of the session, it will summarize that data to the clinician with insights and kind of observations and things that you can do. So for an individual therapy session of any kind, about 6,000 words are transacted between a clinician and a client. And what your job is somehow the job of an AI is to take that data, analyze it, provide insights that the clinician may not have been aware of. It's kind of like, almost like having a co-therapist sitting there, and at the end you say, what did you hear? Here's what I heard, and that kind of thing. But you need to be able to have a fallback, because when you think about implementing these things, the key to this, and I want to stress this, is to always err on the side of transparency with your clients about what you're doing. What we find is that if you ask for permission to do this when you do your intakes, like when you ask for permission to treat generally, incorporate what you're going to do with AI, and you have to give them the ability to opt out of this. For whatever reason, they might say, no, I don't want to do that. What we found is about 97% of people agree to it. Not surprisingly, the 3% that don't usually have some form of paranoid ideation. No surprise there. But the second use case is that if I've given you permission, but then on the 6th session, I say, Doc, I don't want you to use that thing today. You have to have a way to opt out of that, and we have a fallback that allows you to just write 6 bullet points, and it'll build the note for you from that. So you don't lose the advantages of artificial intelligence, but it's not as seamless as just sitting here having a conversation. And so you take that and turn it into 300 words in a constructive note that you can use then to document. We view the goal, in the case of Elios, the goal ultimately is that the single source of truth is that signed progress note. And once that note is signed, everything that helped construct that gets deleted. There is no residual trail. There's nothing that's discoverable. You'll find that some organizations, some AIs, because of the way they're constructed, they will take the session and save either an audio file or a text file, a transcript of that, and then once the session is over, then they will analyze that whole session. And we don't do that. We take about a 2.5-minute segment of that conversation, analyze it, throw it away, go to the next 2.5, throw it away. And at the end, you have a set of recommendations. And once the clinician has said, I'll take this one, I'll take that one, I don't want this one, when they sign that note, all of that gets deleted and is not discoverable. So from a liability perspective, I always get a little bit worried about if there's a transcript of something hanging around out there, something bad happens, the lawyer gets involved, and they say, doctor, the AI recommended you do X, Y, and Z, but you didn't do that. Would my client still be alive today if you had? I don't want that stuff hanging out there as a former CEO. I can tell you, that's not where I want to be. So same thing with group therapy. We've cracked the code on how to do groups and to differentiate the voices in the session. We can do up to about 15 voices and know exactly who said what. And as you know, when you do group therapy, I'm an old group therapist, you do a process note that summarizes what happened in the group. The group today was angry. We talked about issues of loss and grief, and then you do individual participation notes. Denny's participation in the group today, he got in an argument with one of the other group members, but you don't name that group member in Denny's note. This does all that automatically. And so what we find is that this is the secret sauce on some of this is that this is not artificial intelligence in the strictest sense, it's augmented intelligence. And that's true of all of healthcare. There is every application of artificial intelligence in healthcare today is augmented intelligence. It's there to help a clinician do something, not to do something for a clinician. It's there to give you information, to provide advice, suggestions. Have you thought about this? Did you notice that? That's why we call it augmented intelligence. The results of this are not bad. No completion times for individual go down 15 to 5 minutes, 84% improvement in session to sign time, that is from the end of the session to when somebody gets it signed. Note writing increases 96 hours to 4 hours to get notes submitted. And these benefits, by the way, are not Elios. This is taken from the industry generally. We have similar data we can share with you. From a reimbursement perspective, using just the ambient listening, not the compliance or RCM tools that we also offer, just the ambient listening, 2.2 days faster time to reimbursement, 16% in claims that are done, and clinician satisfaction is through the roof. We have numerous examples of clinicians who have said to their administration, if you take this away, I'm leaving. And we have examples of organizations that are using it in their recruitment to differentiate themselves from their competitors, saying we have these tools that can help you get your documentation done. Experienced clinicians understand that. New clinicians, they don't know what they're getting into, as you know, but the experienced clinicians say, hey, if you can help me get my documentation done faster and I don't have to sit at home watching TV while I'm doing my notes, that's a good thing. And there's strong clinician benefit. Surprisingly, there's also really good clinical impact. What we've seen in one case was a 36% increase in the use of, or the identification of evidence-based treatments in the progress notes. That was not because the clinician was doing more EBTs, it was because they weren't thinking to document that they were doing the EBTs. The AI caught it and said, today the therapist used motivational interviewing, today the therapist used CBT for depression, and the clinician said, oh yeah, that's right, I did. And they don't think about it. So we see this, you get a better, higher quality note when that happens. We see improvements in symptom reduction, increases in client engagement, 97% reported that the AI feedback was accurate. We think best practice is that no more than 80% of the note should have been written by the AI, because we still want the clinician's voice in that note, and we have a way to track that on the back end. CBT compliance goes up. Training for a GPT-based bot was to interact with a patient. This is somebody else's data. And then we do research on this kind of thing. And one of the randomized controlled trials we did where we randomly assigned Elios to one group of clinicians, another group did not get it. We were looking for things like, did they get their notes done more quickly, was the clinician satisfied, all that kind of thing. But what we found, found all that, but what we also found was that the clients of the clinicians who used Elios had higher PHQ-9 scores, higher GAD-7 scores, and stayed in treatment longer. And we think the reason for that is because the clinician was not preoccupied with what did they have to write in the note. When that session was done, they were more present with that client, and the therapeutic relationship was enhanced. So we're seeing that, and we saw it in the RCT, and we're hearing it anecdotally also from our clients who are saying, yep, our clinicians are reporting the same thing. So the bottom line is that technology cannot be uninvited. It is what it is. It's coming into our space very quickly, and you're going to see more and more choices. If I could leave you with one thing, do not. Everybody in this room, whether you're using AI or not, should have an AI policy, and one of those things in there should be what your position is on using the off-the-shelf tools like ChatGPT for clinical purposes. Even if you haven't bought a commercial, a vendored AI, you should be able to do that. And so, with that, I will say thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, NAATP, for having me here. Here to talk to you about highly reliable organizations. What are the essential elements to prevent burnout, detect turnover, and correct cultures? So I'm going to start with my why. But before I do that, I want to talk about your why. So you're here today. We've been here at this conference. You've been connecting, learning, and we're focused on future-proofing treatment. And I just want to say that many people in this room, I have a deep amount of respect for you. You're amazing healers and change agents in our industry, and you're very influential. And many of you lead teams of healers, and by doing so, you save lives, you heal families, and you impact communities so that those populations you work with can thrive. And at my organization and the circles that I'm involved with, we call this heart work. Before I talk about heart work, I want to talk about my why. And so my name is Devin Waite, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. Hi. Thank you. I have 3 boys that are and my lovely wife that are the lights in my life, and they only know the recovered version of me. I've worked in the industry for 23 years, and some of those years I had the pleasure of being business partners with one of our current board members, Paul Alexander, and ex-board member Mike Netherton. And at that time, we operated a treatment center in Orange County, California, and we helped many, many individuals during that time. And that work that we did there had a ripple effect. I'm acutely aware that the help that we provided to those clients and those families had an impact where, they ended up helping others, and those families healed and helped other families, and those individuals went back to those communities and made a positive impact there. And so that ripple effect really kept me going for years. And in fact, I worked with some of the people in this room in doing that. And I really rode that wave in terms of taking care of others. And it was really my distinct pleasure to lead healers and to make sure that those healers were taken care of. And one of the things that we did was we implemented an organizational health program, and it was our #1 strategic initiative at all times. Some of the theories that we adopted were Patrick Lencioni, for example, The Advantage. And, in that book that Patrick Lencioni wrote, he talks about organizational health being difficult to quantify. So when we go out there and we talk to other behavioral health organizations about implementing organizational health, sometimes they want to see the immediate results. They want to know the financial cost and the impact and what's the quick fix instead of the long-term play and all of that. So we've noticed that it's been difficult to work with organizations to implement organizational health. But in 2020, I left that partnership and I created Circa Behavioral Healthcare Solutions. And we are an international compliance consulting firm. My counterpart, Maeve O'Neill, who normally speaks, is internationally doing an accreditation at the moment. And a lot of this work we do together. And our purpose is to protect the vulnerable by powerfully outfitting healers so that those suffering turn to God, take arms, and fight honorable battles where victory over them bears witness to a generation to a world and that all generations live free. So our clients, originally when I started Circa Behavioral Healthcare Solutions, I said I'm going to hook our clients on compliance, because everybody needs compliance, and to ensure that the organizations have rails and guards and I could talk to any organization that got some type of compliance problem, but we're going to do catch and release, and we're going to tag them with organizational health and release them. So if I was out there consulting for organizational health, I would have many less clients than we have right now. But we believe that organizational health and compliance put together is one of the best compliance programs that an organization can have. So healers need healing. Before I talk about that, who here remembers Kodak? I do. Well, Kodak was one of the most successful companies of all time. And in 1883, George Eastman invented the personal camera. Over the next 100 years, they created an industry that really didn't exist. They actually invented the digital camera in 1975 and patented it in 1978. However, by 2010, the personal camera industry was dead. And in 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. That same year, in contrast, Facebook purchased Instagram for over $1 billion. And Instagram had 18 employees at the time, whereas Kodak had thousands of employees. And so some may argue that, the fall of Kodak, there was probably more involved. Why didn't they go digital? They invented it, they patented it. What was their financial constraints? Who knows? But ultimately, Kodak imploded. And I have to ask myself, well, did they make a decision to implode? And I don't believe that anyone sets out to actually implode. I don't think that's the goal or, intent of really anybody in the field. And if we connect it back to behavioral health, implosion to us means burnout or extreme burnout. So one of the things that we see throughout the field is the immense amount of burnout and staff turnover in our field. I have to thank Dennis for the data that he presented earlier. And our workforce is dwindling. And if we are really here future-proofing treatment, then we must have a focus on workforce. And I'm very grateful that NAATP has had this as an area of focus, and my counterpart, Maeve O'Neill, has been on a committee serving in that role. One of the things that we do when we start working with our clients is we give them a framework to be able to work with, and the whole purpose of this is not only to implement a compliance program, but to have it be rooted in organizational health, and we always urge the individuals who work in the field to take care of themselves. And I'm sure many of you in this room have a story. I have mine where I needed to take more care of myself. But the first structure is well-being supports. And that can look as wonderful as doing morning meditations with the staff. There's these meditation pods that my counterpart Maeve O'Neill is a big fan of, and then some of the regular stuff like ethics, and so one thing I love about NAATP is just, zero tolerance for unethical behavior in the industry, and a lot of its members stick together because they have that in common, that they're highly ethical organizations, and with ethics comes compliance, and but there's so many organizations that I find out there that have different compliance challenges, and but if they're rooted in ethics and they're trusting their staff to make the right decision on the client's behalf 100% of the time, and they're giving them the support and oversight to do that, then we find that those compliance issues can be quite easily overcome. But it can't go without having good oversight and good leadership. The next thing are workforce structures, and to us that means policies. It's usually where we start when we start working with an organization, and we've heard about policies today and the urge to create them, like an AI policy, which I can't agree more. And if we're talking about compliance and that use of off-the-shelf AI, there's so much risk when it comes to privacy breaches as well too. So our policy manual that we work with organizations to implement is really the root of the organization. And with that, we don't want it to be one of those things that just gets put up on the shelf. And when I started working with Maeve O'Neill, she told me how much she loves policy, and I knew I had the right person to work with, because many organizations don't really enjoy policies and are really living and breathing by them. But how important it is. But more important than just the book on the shelf or the electronic manual is really the implementation of it and the education with our staff on a regular basis. So, as I ran the treatment center, there's so many times to educate staff and in a certain policy or the why behind it and why we do certain things, and then take notes to maybe adjust that policy. And sometimes policies need adjusted on the fly, and sometimes they need reworked once a year. Either way, we recommend they get reworked once a year. Moreover, with that is communication. So there's just so many opportunities to make sure that staff have the support and guidelines that they need, but it doesn't need to be a lunch and learn all the time. It can be a brief check-in in the hallway. It can be, all that kind of stuff. So last but not least, our workplace skills. And with that, we have monitoring of those skills. So when we teach our staff, and many of the staff are highly educated, but how are we, doing that work? And what are some of the guardrails and constraints we have, like an electronic medical record, to keep us, headed in the straight path. Also with policies and procedures, and then of course the enforcement. We have internal enforcement, such as our internal auditors, if any of you have an internal auditing team. And our hope is with those types of teams that it's more of a collaborative approach and not necessarily punitive unless it needs to be. Of course, with external monitoring or external enforcement, sometimes can feel very punitive when the state shows up or our accrediting bodies. Not always, but certainly there's a certain fear there we see with staff. So what we love doing is supporting them, making them understand that this is a part of the process. And when we approach those as leaders, those opportunities for learning and to have a third party come in and enforce us, then it's always an opportunity to learn and to make sure that we've got the right systems and guardrails in place. And then I also would like to state reinforcement. So enforcement just doesn't come once a year when the state shows up, or twice a year, or every 3 years with an accrediting body. It comes with continuous reinforcement through our leadership and staff. And then last but not least is a response. So if anything does bump up against a rail in terms of compliance or ethics, that we move that ship back into the middle, and we don't take it ashore and wreck. And so creating corrective action plans and having a learning organization that's willing to do that. So all of this work we call heart work. And if anybody knows Maeve O'Neill, she's always throwing a blue heart next to everything she does, every text message and our emails and all that. And we believe the heart work is the implementation of compliance and organizational health together. But it starts with us as leaders and people that are running the organization. And with that, it really takes being committed 100% of the time. There's a gentleman named Clayton Christensen, and Clayton Christensen works at Harvard Business School, and in fact he was named by Forbes as one of the most influential business theorists within the last 50 years. And he wrote an incredible book called How Will You Measure Your Life? Prior to this, Clayton had the opportunity to study in England, where he played on a basketball team over there. And that team had made it to the championship finals, and in England it would have been the equivalent of like the Final Four here in the US. So it was a big deal, and unfortunately the championship game that he was going to play in landed on a Sunday. Well, Clayton Christensen made a commitment when he was 16 years old to observe some of his faith rules and to observe Sabbath, and to not do anything on Sunday, especially play a basketball game, to have it as a day of rest. So he really wrestled with that because it was one Sunday out of 1,000 Sundays that he would ever experience. And in fact, he tells the story of some of his most supportive people in his life, his family, his coach, his players, all tried to convince him that that this one, wouldn't God make an exception for this one time for the betterment of the team? But Clayton held his ground, and he states that that looking back and upholding that commitment proved to be one of the most important decisions of his life. And what we've learned from that is that it's easier to hold to your principles 100% of the time than it is to hold to your principles 98% of the time. It's in other words, it's easier to be committed 100% of the time than 98% of the time. It's that 2% that causes that wrestling. And the really tragic cosmic joke here is that the 100% commitment creates 100% freedom. And the reason for that is because the decision's already made for you if you're committed 100% of the time. And you don't have to wrestle with that 2%. So the reason I bring this up is because life is really just one unending stream of extenuating circumstances. And we always have opportunities to break our commitments. And so, upholding to those is something that we believe that hard work that you'll find that freedom. And so, the implementation of the supports, the structures, the skills, we really urge you to do that and do this important work. We need to do this. Our people that we lead need it as well too. The healers, really need us, and we need to be creating these supports and structures to invite new healers into our industry so that we can future-proof it. So we have many more individuals, vulnerable individuals that need our help. We have many families that need healing, and the communities that those individuals and families will go back to are on the precipice of our influence to really help them thrive. So we beg you to commit to this 100% and to do that hard work that we call the hard work. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. You guys are impressing me. I don't think I've seen a Wednesday crowd like this, and most of my buddies I know are. I think most of my buddies are actually on a plane getting out of here. I said, one of my friends said, I'll show up, and I would normally say, don't worry about it, but I said, it's usually an hour of your life you're not going to get back, but it's only 20 minutes today, so we'll be okay. But at any rate, my name's Gary Fisher. I'm the Director Emeritus of the Cirque Lodge, and it's a title that I'm very proud to have. It's quite a lengthy title for a purely honorary role, but hopefully it signifies that, that I did something good for the company and that they wanted to keep me around. I was laughing with Marvin and the staff, and by the way, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come up here and speak, but I said I just can't imagine that there's that big of a population in our industry that's worried about what's going to happen when we walk away, right? The truth of the matter is if you were anything like me, I was totally in on trying to make my organization successful, and as a result, keep my job, not walk away from it, right? And I think that's an interesting piece for us, right? Is that if you were anything like me, I worked hard in my business, but I didn't spend much time working on my business. And as a result, as far as talking about why it's difficult to walk away, the answer is easy, and that's that we're all addicted to the miracle. We all kind of get started because, maybe we're the miracle ourselves. But the truth of the matter is, the emotional paycheck that we get out of our industry is always greater than the financial paycheck. But the truth of the matter is if we care about our institutions, if we care about our companies, we need to spend some time thinking about what happens next. So I wanted to sit down and I wanted to talk a little bit to all of you about what comes next. And to do that, I'm going to tell you a story. And the first, I need to first of all introduce you to this gentleman. So most of the people in here won't recognize this gentleman, but Coach Wooden was a basketball coach back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, you know, most people, their most influential people in their lives are like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, right? But no, Gary has Coach Wooden. But one of the things that, and in the 60s, when I was a kid growing up, he was maybe what we would consider, Denny might argue with this with Bobby Knight, but we thought of him as the greatest basketball coach. And that was a big deal for me as a kid. And one of the things that I'll share with you about Coach Wooden is he had a penchant for like great sayings and great quotes. And probably his most famous quote is this one: that failure to prepare is preparing to fail. And so to marry all of this about our institutions and about Coach Wooden's quote, I wanted to take a moment and tell you guys a story. It has nothing to do with behavioral health, but maybe it does. But, and hopefully, you know, I can wrap it up and it'll all make sense for you. But the story is mine. And I'm a young man. It's 1973, and I am working for my father. And my father had a large building, owned a large building supply concern. And what we would do is that we sold mostly drywall products. We had about 50 semis and a couple hundred trailers. And we would load those semis up with steel from Geneva Steel in Provo, Utah, in Pittsburgh, Des Moines, and we would take that to the coast. And then those trucks, being in Los Angeles, would load up with building supplies, and they would turn around and they would come back. And one of the things that I can tell you is that when trucks are always loaded up, it's an amazingly profitable business. It was a good one. And what I can tell you about the building supply business is that we could pretty much sell all the drywall we could get our hands on, and we could get our hands on a lot. Well, about this time, a large drywall concern, United States Gypsum, they come in and they want to buy my father's business. And, you know, to tell you the truth, my father's 56 years old. He has two partners. Both of them are younger than he is. And, you know, everybody's making money hand over fist. These are heady times. Nobody's thinking about selling, right? And in 1973, I don't even know if the term succession planning or what's next was even in the vocabulary, right? So as a result, they made a decision to hold on. We fast forward to 1982. My father is now 65 years of age, and he has had a couple of health events, and he pretty much wants to sell. But the issue is now the earnings are less, and even more importantly, the multiples that people will pay for those earnings are almost nil. So he makes a decision. Here's probably the other thing that I should share with you is a couple of his other options. His oldest boy has gone to Colorado to start a business of his own, and his youngest boy is neck deep in an addiction. So as a result, we had no progression plan. The only other option at that time was to sell it to his two partners, but his two partners didn't have the capital to take him out. So he did what probably many of us would do, right? He made the decision to hold on. He made the decision to see it through to the end till time got better. We do that, right? Seems plausible. And in 1984, I didn't think it'd be this hard. My father passes away from a massive coronary. And while I certainly give a lot of credit to Coach Wooden, my father was the most influential person in my life. And what I'll share with you all here is I just don't believe that that needed to happen. You know, I mean, my father, he might have passed away, That happens. But I think him trying to navigate that business through that industry at that time led prematurely to his passing. I'll share you another picture. This is my mother and father right at the time they were starting building products. And it's one of the favorite photos. I have it on my desk. But, we can talk about the devastation because my father passing away, that was one thing. He was a smart guy. He left my mother financially stable. But the truth of the matter is that the two partners, I'll tell you a piece about my father. He was a chemistry guy, right? And when I say chemistry, he had chemistry before culture was the word, right? He was the guy he was a go along, get along guy. He was a guy who could get you on the bus. He was the guy who was the lubrication within the business. And with my father gone, the two partners started to bicker. Their competitors could see that there was kind of blood in the water. They started to court their longtime customers, and 4 years after my father passed away, the business was bankrupt. And, essentially nobody got out alive, right? Because nobody had prepared, right? There was no preparation. They had no thoughts about what was going to happen if somebody retired or if somebody passed away. None. And there was total devastation, right? The two partners, they left penniless. At the time that my father had passed away, the company had 120 employees, so there was, 120 families not getting a paycheck. And the biggest, I thought the most devastating piece for me was my mom. And although that he had left her financially in good shape, she wasn't prepared to navigate the next 20 years, right? She wasn't prepared to go do that on her own. And again, I just don't think that needed to happen. I remember, you guys, I have it emblazoned in my mind. I remember going up to my mom's house after my father had passed away. And as I pulled up to the house, I walked up and the lights were off, right? And I walked in and there was I could see the glow of the TV. And my mom was sitting there. She was about this far away from the TV, wearing one of his sweaters. And to this day, it was probably the saddest day of my life. So as you can imagine, what happened is that I was bound and determined that that was not going to happen to me at Cirque Lodge, right? We were going to have a plan. We were going to have a person in place. That was going to happen. What happened to my mother was not going to happen to my wife. And so the truth of the matter is, as we go forward, I'm getting ready to retire in May of 2020. And you know what we had done? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We were the 2020 version of building products staring us in the face. We were Coach Wooden's failing to prepare has prepared us to fail. And what I'll share with you is that then the miracle happened, right? Albeit I didn't see it as a miracle at the time. I'm skiing with a friend of mine. We get tangled up going down the hill. He's much bigger than I am. He lands on me, breaks a couple ribs, collapsed lung. They take me to the hospital. I'm like 12 days away from the retirement, right? And I'm sitting there. It's March 8th, 2020. We all kind of know this time frame. And while I'm sitting in that, hospital bed with a tube in my chest and a collapsed lung, the COVID pandemic gets unleashed on the country. So I'm sitting there watching grocery stores get ransacked for toilet paper. Again, just can't get out of bed. And the owner of Cirque Lodge, a gentleman by the name of Richard Lose, he walks in. And he looks at me and he said, it was maybe one of the funniest moments I've had. He looks at me and he says, hey, he says, I don't think it's And the truth of the matter is that was accurate, right? We weren't ready for any industry destabilization and certainly not an administrative change. Essentially, what we had to do is we had to put the boat back in the river. But after I got out of the hospital, we did come up with a plan. And that's what I want to talk to you about. And so the very first thing is, what did we do, right? We started talking about it. What kind of person were we looking for? What were their attributes? Were they internal? Were they external? Cirque Lodge is a family-owned business, still is. And most importantly, I think that we decided on going with an internal candidate because they understood, we thought they would understand the chemistry that we had built. That's what we wanted. So really there were 5 candidates. 2 of the candidates were pretty much my age. And so the problem with picking those candidates is that, we could do it, but 4 or 5 years we were just going to be doing they were going to be doing the same thing over and over again. So it really got down to 3 candidates, Richard's family members, all qualified. But one had a tech background, one had an operations background, and one had a background associated with business development. And so one of the things that my father, going back to my father, he used to say, is that revenue cures all ills. It was one of my favorite sayings he had. And so as a result, we picked the person who was associated with the business development side of the industry. But mostly, what I'll tell you is that's not why we were picking her. We were picking her because we believed that she had the best chemistry, because we believed that she could get in with the staff and keep it going, right? That those partners, wouldn't divest themselves, as happened at Building Products. So what did we do? We didn't really announce at this time that this person was going to be the executive director, but what we did was we started them with putting them in front of our referents, right? Going to referent dinners. We started putting them in front of our families, speaking to the families. We started putting her in front of the staff. We started, if there was having her make key hires. If there was a situation where there was a fire, she had the hose. The second thing we did is we started having me abdicate my role. Again, walking away, kind of taking an aside, people coming up and having me, defer all of my decisions, and we deferred them to her. And I can tell you, when I got ready to retire in December of 2021 and ultimately walked away in February of 2022, you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because the transformation had already taken place. We were just making the next sequential step. And what I'll share with you is I'm not really connected with the nuts and bolts of the facility anymore. Nobody likes a quarterback to leave the game and still call plays, right? That's not good. But what I can share with you is I do know that 2023 and 2024 were the 2 highest grossing, most profitable years in the history of Cirque Lodge. So you can clap for that. That's a good one. So gets down to that transformation, or that succession plan has taken place. But now, what about me, right? How did I know it was time? How did I know it was time to walk away? And the first one that I will share with you is that, and I'll share, this is one of my favorite photos. It's a Coke machine. And while that is not exactly the Coke machine that was in our building supply yard, it was one that looked very much like it. And they will dispense little 8-ounce Coke bottles. I remember we would put a dime in there, and it would give you a little ice-cold Coca-Cola, and on a hot day, it was about as good a treat as you could ever have. And I remember I'm sitting on my dad's desk, and he looks at me one day, and he says, "What do you know about that 8-ounce Coke bottle?" And I said, "Well, when I'm done, I want another one." And he said, "That's right." He said, "In life, be an 8-ounce Coke bottle. Don't overstay your welcome. Leave before they want you to leave." The second part I'll share with you is resilience. And the truth of the matter is my resilience had really waned, right? I used to be able to watch people's triumphs and people's failures, and I could distance myself from that, right? I could. I could excuse people's stupidity in my own, and I did that pretty well. But there just came a time where I started to bring it home with me. And my wife's in the audience today, and I'll apologize here because I'm sure I wasn't that much fun to live with at that point. So my resilience has started to wane. And then the other part is I remember, and this line was one of mine, and that was that it was better to leave a year too early than a day too late. And that really came from nothing more than watching some of my sports heroes just end up in the wrong jersey, right? Just trying to hang on. So, you know, what I'll wrap up with is that, and, you know, last but not least, I think the biggest thing for me was I didn't want to stand. I didn't want to stand in the way of all of you. You know, I'm not sure that 30, 40, 50-year careers are all that appropriate, and I don't think I agree with lifetime appointments, right? The young woman who we had prepared for the job was ready to fly, and really she needed to fly without a net. And what I'll share with you is fly she did. I think that he would have been very proud.